Hello and welcome back to the case study series at DPR. Today we will delve into the dangers of making judgments on one's character before all the facts are known, and the impact acting based on unsubstantiated beliefs could have, whether intended or not. Let's look at a case where a search of an accused's home was conducted, and literature was discovered that some found odd and disturbing. I will note that the books in question were not illegal and are available through typical marketplaces such as Amazon and online bookstores. The case study focuses on how this literature was used in a bail hearing by the Crown to state that the accused may be a threat to society if he were to be released. Perceptions and judgments formed before a person has an opportunity to give their perspective on a situation can be damaging because they may not be accurate or complete. When these perceptions and judgments are presented to others or expressed to the person in question, it can lead to misunderstandings, conflicts, and negative consequences. For example, in a workplace setting, if a manager forms a negative perception of an employee before hearing their perspective on a situation, they may make decisions that are detrimental to the employee's career and the company's performance. Similarly, in a social setting, if someone forms a negative perception of a person before getting to know them, they may miss out on a valuable friendship or connection. Another example is in a court of law. If the prosecution has a perception of the defendant as guilty before hearing their defense, it can lead to wrongful convictions. It is important to keep in mind that perceptions and judgments can be biased, incomplete, and influenced by various factors, and that everyone's perspective is valuable in understanding a situation. It is always best, until all the facts are known and the unknowns clarified, to withhold assumptions and utilize respectful communication. Let's begin this journey by sharing a historical case that may help us open our minds to see that nothing is simple, and things may not be exactly as they first appear. Now I give you the story of Charles Whitman. On August 1, 1966, Charles Whitman committed a heinous act of violence, brutally murdering 16 innocent people and injuring 32 others at the University of Texas at Austin. His actions were those of a monster, a cold-blooded killer who took the lives of innocent individuals without a second thought. But as more information about Charles Whitman's life came to light, a different story began to emerge. It was revealed that he had been a former U.S. Marine, a man who had served his country with honor. He had been a good citizen, respected by those who knew him. However, in the months leading up to the shooting, he had begun to experience severe headaches and had been complaining of suicidal thoughts. It was also found that Charles Whitman had left a note in which he stated that he had been planning the shooting for months, though he did not want to harm anyone. He felt compelled beyond his control to follow through. He felt he had been troubled by various physical and emotional illnesses. He also wrote that he hoped that an autopsy would reveal a physical reason for his actions, so that his family would not blame themselves for his actions. The autopsy revealed a tumor on his brain, which some experts believe could have contributed to his aggressive behavior and lack of impulse control. Does this raise the question, was Charles Whitman indeed a monster, as one would initially conclude, or was he a man whose actions were influenced by factors beyond his control? The truth is, it is impossible to know for certain. But one thing is certain: Charles Whitman's actions were a tragic consequence of a society that failed to address his mental health issues adequately, and a failure to recognize the warning signs that were present. It serves as a reminder that every individual, regardless of their actions, is a complex being with struggles and challenges. It is also a call to action for us as a society, to do better in addressing mental health issues, recognizing warning signs, and providing proper care for individuals who are struggling. It is also a call to action to consider the responsibility of society and the state in reducing the stigma that currently deters individuals from seeking assistance. Compassion and recognition that mental health is a continuum on a spectrum, and not simply good, poor, healthy, or sick, is essential in this effort and cannot be fixed through punishment and imposed hardship when it is of no fault of the sufferer. Current judicial policy dictates the segregation of these individuals away from normal members of society into inhumane isolation and living conditions, and are treated as lesser than, denying funding and support for illnesses that can't be physically seen, and only treating physical illness has led society to treat these ailments that again are of no fault of the sufferer by separating them and imposing punishment. No one would choose to be mentally ill and receive this treatment. As we reflect on the tragic events of August 1, 1966, let us not see Charles Whitman as a monster, but rather as a reminder of the consequences of neglecting the well-being of our fellow human beings. Now let us set the scene of the bail hearing for the accused as seen from his eyes as a 40-year-old who had no experience with the judicial system and had never been in trouble with the law before this incident. I will note that the nature of the charges surrounded the possession and importation of a small quantity, less than 10, electric conducting devices, commonly known as stun guns, with 2 being labeled as a firearm. There was also a small quantity of 2 Schedule I substances found in the accused's school backpack during the police search. It has become evident that the safety of the community has been called into question, should the accused not be held in segregation, due to the discovery of a 7-book autograph collector's series of literature he had acquired and possessed in his residence. The books in question were written by a chemist, Steve Pressel, better known by his pen name of Uncle Fester. Mr. Pressel started writing his first book on a prison typewriter, during a period of incarceration, in protest of the policies of his era. Back to the present day, it was the mutual opinion of the courtroom occupants, based on the titles of the books, that the subjects were disturbing in nature, and that there is no logical reason that anyone should own books harboring these titles. A series of participants in the bail hearing conjointly displayed their confusion and concern for the accused's mental state, having owned this literature, fearing an indication that the accused's intentions were to employ this knowledge contained within, to impose harm. Both sides expressed bewilderment, denoting any other reasonings inexplicable. All were in agreement that a psychological assessment was deemed necessary in conjunction with concurrent counseling, to figure out the why, and attempt to reform a troubled mind with a history of mental illness. A further suggestion of a full forensic psychological risk assessment and analysis be performed to determine if a reintegration into society would be possible, while keeping the public's best interest in mind. The accused was present during this display of concern, seated in a booth visible through clear plexiglass, wearing handcuffs and clothing from 9 days previous, without being afforded, despite multiple requests, an opportunity to shave and make his appearance presentable for the hearing that would determine the state of his pending freedom. It is unclear if prejudice or his appearance were ultimately responsible for the looks of disdain cast during the theatrical discussion surrounding the literature in question. Still, they were received with the accused's own bewilderment to hear himself being discussed in this nature and portrayed in such a dark way. Now that the scene has been set, let us take a quick detour to add some parallel references to the accused, having collected these books, and other behaviors members of our society similarly engage in. It is essential to compare and contrast the following of Uncle Fester with the following of other more disturbing happenings that many individuals choose to immerse themselves in. For example, the anti-queer violence and heinous murders committed by Bruce MacArthur are a devastating reminder of the harm that can be inflicted on society. MacArthur's actions caused immense pain and suffering for the victims and their loved ones. In contrast, the following of Uncle Fester is much less harmful and is not a direct cause of violence or harm. Furthermore, it is essential to consider how society also engages in the consumption of true crime, such as through the popular murder podcast, Uncover, which is funded by the Canadian government, produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and My Favorite Murder, which may also glamorize violence and criminal behavior. True crime podcasts have gained significant popularity in recent years, with many individuals tuning in to listen to and learn about various criminal cases. A new YouGov survey finds nearly half of Americans say they enjoy true crime content, and a third consume it at least once a week. That includes a quarter, 24%, who say they consume it multiple times per week. Only 30% say they never consume true crime content in Canada. True crime podcasts are among the top 10 most popular podcast genres, with many listeners consuming these podcasts regularly. The podcast Uncover, again note, is funded by the Canadian government and produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. This podcast has gained a large following and has been praised by media outlets such as Canadian Reader's Digest as a must-consume true crime and murder podcast. Season 3, having 8 episodes plus a bonus episode, boasts. For years, Toronto's gay village worried a serial killer was in their midst. Men were disappearing from the neighborhood, but police insisted there was no evidence of foul play. Then, in January 2018, police arrested Bruce MacArthur for the murders of 8 men. Police are now reopening dozens of unsolved murders from the village, dating back to 1975. Journalist Justin Ling has covered this story for over 5 years, and now he's going back to shed light on these long-forgotten murders. Another example is the podcast, My Favorite Murder, which has a large following in Canada and globally. As of 2020, the podcast gets 35 million downloads per month. The podcast's hosts Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark have been praised for their storytelling abilities, and the podcast has been credited for starting the Murderino movement. Other popular true crime podcasts are consumed by Canadians, such as the first podcast ever to reach 5 million downloads, Serial, with more than 743 million total downloads, Sword and Scale, Casefile, and Criminal. Some engage the audience with questions such as, which race do you prefer the murder victims to be? It's also worth noting that while true crime podcasts can provide an in-depth understanding of criminal cases and the criminal justice system, they can also have a significant impact on the communities affected by these crimes, and can also potentially romanticize violence and criminal behavior. It is crucial to consider the ethical implications of consuming this type of content, and the impact it may have on the victims and their families. It is also important to consider the societal context of different forms of consumption, and not to judge individuals based on one possession or interest. Uncle Fester's books may be controversial, but they do not directly cause harm, and should not be used to stigmatize those who possess them. The Accused, a student of social science, in ownership of the series of books written by Steve Pressel, is a justifiable and valuable addition to one's academic research. These books provide a unique and in-depth understanding of various social and political issues. If we pause to think about why someone studying social science may decide to have this literature in their collection, we will see that these books directly relate to the topics social science encompasses. Historical significance. Steve Preisel's books were written during a specific time period and reflect the social and political climate of that time. A student of social science may be interested in understanding how the war on drugs and the criminalization of certain substances impacted society. Freedom of speech and freedom of information. These books were written as a form of protest and as an advocate for freedom of speech and freedom of information. Study of social movements. Steve Preisel's books can be seen as a part of a larger social movement that challenges government policies and the criminalization of certain substances. Study of drug policy. Steve Preisel's books provide an in-depth understanding of the production of illegal substances and the impact of drug policies on society. Study of crime and deviance. Steve Preisel's books provide an understanding of the criminalization of specific activities and the impact it has on society. Study of social inequality. Steve Preisel's books provide an understanding of how specific policies and criminalization disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Study of the prison industrial complex. Steve Preisel's books provide an understanding of how the criminalization of specific activities and the prison system impact society. Study of the media and its representation of crime. Steve Preisel's books are controversial and have been represented in the media in various ways. Study of the impact of government policies on individuals. Steve Preisel's books provide an understanding of how government policies impact individuals and their families. Study of the intersectionality of issues. Steve Preisel's books provide an understanding of how issues such as freedom of speech, drug policy, and social inequality intersect and impact society. Additionally, owning a book does not mean endorsing or promoting the content of the book. It's a way of understanding and studying the subject. It is important to note that the consumption of true crime, including listening to true crime podcasts about cases such as Bruce McArthur, can have a significant impact on the communities affected by these crimes. It can also potentially romanticize violence and criminal behavior. While true crime podcasts can be informative and provide a deeper understanding of criminal cases, it is also essential to consider the ethical implications of consuming this type of content and the impact it may have on the victims and their families. Steve Preisel's writing, while controversial, did not directly cause harm to society. The books do not promote violence or criminal behavior, and the impact of the book on society is limited to the possession of the book and not on actual criminal activities. In summary, the actions of Bruce McArthur were severe and had a devastating impact on society, whereas Steve Preisel's writing, while controversial, did not directly cause harm to society. Based on the statistics, it would stand to reason that the very people who saw the worst in the accused, without directly inquiring despite his presence in the room, themselves could be argued to have engaged in much more odd behaviors by actively seeking out these podcasts on a weekly basis. It's important to note that owning these books does not mean endorsing or promoting the content of the book. It's a way of understanding and studying the subject. These books can be found on Amazon, online, and in used bookstores, and some are hard to find. For social science students, they provide valuable insights and perspectives that cannot be found elsewhere. The ownership of these books versus the consumption of true crime and murder podcasts, such as those about the case of Bruce McArthur, however different, come from the same place of curiosity. It would not be reasonable to jump to such conclusions as, If one were to be caught listening to a murder podcast, they intended to study these to themselves, become a murderer. Nor would you assume if this was in conjunction with having found several 8 knives with specialized blades, and several larger sharpened knives, sticking into a specialized block of wood, stored most accessibly on the kitchen counter, that they may pose a risk to society, and require forensic psychological evaluation that will ultimately determine if they should be institutionalized. On the other hand, the ownership of Steve Preisel's books, while controversial, does not directly cause harm to society. They provide valuable insights and perspectives on various social and political issues. The impact of the book on society is limited to the possession of the book and not to actual criminal activities. Owning Steve Preisel's books does not justify one being assumed harmful to society. On the contrary, if these issues were sought to be understood instead of feared, valuable insights and perspectives on various social and political issues may be seen more clearly from an evidence-based perspective, affording more compassion and positive societal change. Had his crimes been violent and gruesome, we may not be here today in this discussion, as many would have copies of these books, making it normal and acceptable upon the first podcast appearance. In conclusion, as a student of social science, the ownership of the series of books written by Steve Preissel is a valuable and justifiable addition to one's academic research, as they provide unique insights and perspectives on various social and political issues. Thank you for tuning in today. We hope to have inspired inquiry into our viewers' own thoughts and beliefs. We look forward to your comments below. Take care, and thank you again for keeping an open mind. Your support in the quest for positive drug policy reform is always appreciated.